He slammed $2 on the table so hard the coins bounced. "I'll take her." The crowd went silent. Then the laughter started. A broke cowboy. A woman no man wanted. $2 changing everything. But here's what nobody knew that day: the real price paid wasn't measured in silver. It was measured in something far more costly. And by the time this story ends, you'll understand why that moment in Red Hollow, Colorado, shook an entire valley to its foundation. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The auctioneer's voice carried across the entire square like a slap. $2. Do I hear $2 for the Whitmore girl? Come on, gentlemen. Somebody make an offer before I fall asleep up here. Laughter rolled through the crowd like thunder. Men nudged each other with their elbows. Women whispered behind gloved hands. A group of younger ranch hands near the fence were laughing so hard, one of them doubled over, had falling into the dirt. And Clara Whitmore stood on that wooden platform, straight-backed, chin-level hands clasped in front of her, and she did not move a single muscle in her face. Not one. Because she had decided somewhere in the 20 minutes she had already been standing up there while the price dropped lower and lower and lower that she would rather die than give Red Hollow the satisfaction of watching her cry. The auctioneer, a round-faced man named Holt, who smelled like cheap tobacco and enjoyed his job far too much, mopped his forehead with a handkerchief and tried again. "Now, gentlemen, she's educated, reads and writes, speaks proper English, which some of you could stand to be around more of." More laughter. "Her father ran Whitmore Merchant Supply out of Denver before the business went under. She knows accounts, she knows figures." "She knows how to lose money, you mean?" someone shouted from the back, and the whole square erupted. Clara felt the heat rise in her face, and she pressed her fingernails into her own palms hard enough to hurt. Pain was useful. Pain kept you anchored. She had not asked to be here. She had not chosen this. After her father died, and the creditors took everything: the store, the house, the furniture down to the last china cup. Her mother had loved, a distant cousin had arranged Clara's passage west, under circumstances that were explained to her only in the vaguest possible terms. "A fresh start," the cousin had said. "Opportunities for a woman of your abilities." What the cousin had not said was, "The opportunity is to stand on a wooden platform while strangers decide if you're worth the trouble." The price had started at $40. That was 3 months ago for another woman, a pretty soft-spoken girl from Kansas, who was purchased inside of 4 minutes and driven away in a covered wagon, while women in the crowd smiled and said, "Wasn't that lovely?" Clara's price had started at $35. It was now $2 and dropping. $1.50. Holt called out, and somewhere in Clara's chest, something cracked. Not broke cracked, like old wood under too much weight. "Do I hear $1.50 for the Whitmore girl? Somebody, anybody?" An old man near the front shook his head and walked away. 2 younger men who had been considering Clara had seen them whispering, pointing, calculating, turned and left as well. And then there was a moment of absolute silence. Just the wind. Just the distant sound of horses. Just the sun beating down on Clara Whitmore's head, while the whole town of Red Hollow decided in real time that she was worth less than a decent meal. Going once. $2. The voice came from the back of the crowd, and it was quiet. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just flat and certain, like a man stating a plain fact. The crowd turned. Clara turned. And she saw him. How was not what anyone would call impressive on first glance. Medium height, lean, in the way that hunger makes a man lean, rather than the way strength does, with a jaw that needed a shave, and a coat that had been repaired along the left sleeve with thread that didn't quite match. He was pushing through the crowd with his hat in his hand, and he was moving toward the auctioneer's table with the kind of deliberate, unhurried purpose of a man who has already made up his mind and isn't going to waste energy explaining himself. William Carter set $2 on the table. He set them down carefully, almost gently. And then he looked up at Clara, not at her dress, not at her figure, not at her face, the way most men looked at women on that platform, measuring and assessing, but directly into her eyes, one human being to another. And what Clara saw there was something that confused her completely. It wasn't pity. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't the look of a man who had just made a purchase. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like apology. "I'll take her," he said again to the auctioneer. $2. Holt blinked. He looked at the coins. He looked at the crowd. He looked back at the cowboy. "Son, are you?" $2, William repeated. "Is that the price, or isn't it?" Holt picked up the coins, bit one out of habit, and shrugged. "Sold." The laughter that followed Clara off the platform was the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. Louder than the creditors knocking on her father's door. Louder than the sound of the auctioneer's hammer at the estate sale when they sold her mother's piano. Louder than anything. A man near the fence called out, "Better you than me. Carter hopes she can at least cook." Another voice. $2. That's what you get for marrying a brain. Billy, nothing left over for looks. William did not turn around. He did not acknowledge a single word. He simply walked to where Clara had stepped down from the platform, held out his hand to help her down the last step. The way you'd help anyone, the way you'd help a stranger. And when she took it, he said very quietly under the noise of everything, "I'm sorry about that. You didn't deserve any of it." Clara looked at him. She didn't know what to say. She had been preparing herself for anger, for humiliation, for demands and conditions, and the particular look men gave women they thought they owned. She had not prepared herself for an apology. "My name is William Carter," he said. "My ranch is about 6 miles east. It's not much to look at." He paused. "Neither am I, for that matter. But I won't mistreat you, and I won't lie to you, and if you're willing to give this a fair chance, I'll do the same." Clara studied his face for a long moment. "Clara Whitmore," she said finally. "And I'd like to know exactly what a fair chance looks like before I agree to anything." For the first time, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. "That sounds about right," he said. "Let's get out of here first, then we'll talk." They rode in silence for the first mile, which suited Clara fine. She needed the silence. She needed to breathe without anyone watching her face for signs of weakness. The wagon was old, and the road was rough, and the horse a brown mare named Something. William muttered under his breath, had a gait that rattled Clara's spine every 40 yards. But the air out here smelled like grass and distance, and after the suffocating closeness of that crowd, Clara breathed it in like medicine. William drove without looking at her. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands easy on the reins, and he didn't try to fill the silence with noise, the way uncomfortable men usually did. After about a mile, Clara spoke. "How much debt do you have?" William turned to look at her. Whatever he'd expected, that wasn't it. "Excuse me. Debt," she said. "How much? I assume a man who bids his last $2 at a marriage auction has financial difficulties. I'd like to know what I'm walking into." A beat of silence. "Those weren't my last $2, he said. "How many did you have left after?" Another beat. Longer. "4, he said. Clara nodded slowly. "And the debt?" William was quiet for a moment. His jaw tightened. Clara recognized it, the particular pride of a man who is not accustomed to admitting hard truths to anyone, let alone a stranger he'd known for 7 minutes. "About $600, he said. "Give or take." Clara absorbed that without expression. $600 in 1881 was not a small sum. It was the kind of number that swallowed ranches whole. "Who do you owe?" "Bank. Local feed supplier. A man named Langford, who I should not have borrowed from. But that's a different conversation." "Why shouldn't you have borrowed from Langford?" William's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Because men like Langford don't lend money to help you," he said. "They lend it to own a piece of you." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the ranch. What do you have?" 40 head of cattle. Pasture's decent, but the north fence needs work. The barn's solid. House is functional. "How many acres?" 300. "Water?" "Creek runs along the south edge. Doesn't dry out." Clara nodded. She was doing arithmetic in her head, the kind of quick automatic calculating that her father had taught her when she was 12 years old, sitting beside him at the merchant's ledger, while he explained that numbers told the truth even when people didn't. "It's not hopeless," she said. William looked at her again. "What?" "The ranch. 600 in debt with 300 acres, 40 head, and a reliable water source. It's not hopeless. It's difficult, but it's not hopeless. There's a difference." He stared at her for a long moment. The mare plodded on. The sun moved. "You really do know about numbers," he said. It wasn't quite admiring. It wasn't mocking either. It was something closer to surprise, the way a man sounds when reality turns out to be different from what he'd been told to expect. "I know about a great many things," Clara said quietly. "The problem is that most people don't consider that an advantage." William turned back to the road. "I'm starting to think they were wrong," he said. The house was worse than functional. Clara had been prepared for rough, and it was rough, but it was also cold and dark, and carried the specific smell of a place where a man had been living alone for a long time. Dishes stacked but not properly washed. Firewood plentiful but badly stacked, so it would take half again as long to get a good fire going. Papers everywhere, and not organized papers, scattered ones, torn ones, papers that had been important once, and then abandoned in the way that happens when a man is overwhelmed and doesn't know where to start. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. William stood behind her, and she could feel his discomfort as clearly as she could feel the draft coming through the gap under the front door. "I told you it wasn't much," he said. "You did," Clara agreed. She stepped inside. She walked to the stack of papers on the table, the rough wooden table that served as both dining surface and desk, and she began sorting. Not because anyone asked her to, not as a performance of usefulness, simply because she could see that the papers were financial documents, and she could see that they were in chaos, and chaos in financial documents was the fastest road to ruin she knew. William watched her from the doorway. "You don't have to," he started. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly, "and tell me what each of these is as I hold it up." "Clara, we can talk about the sleeping arrangements and the household rules and whatever else needs discussing later. Right now, these papers are the most urgent problem in this house." She held up a crumpled document. "Is this the banknote?" He looked at it. "Yes." "When is it due?" 6 weeks. She set it aside carefully. "And this?" He crossed the room and looked. "Feed invoice, from March. You haven't paid a March invoice, and it's September." The silence that followed was its own answer. Clara set that paper in a different pile without comment. She was not going to shame him. Shame had never helped anyone's financial situation, and she had enough experience with the particular humiliation of watching a business collapse to know that the men who caused it rarely did so on purpose. Her father hadn't. He had simply been too proud to admit problems early, and by the time the problems were admitted, they were catastrophic. She was not going to let that happen here. "William," she said, still looking at the papers, "I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I'm not here to judge how this happened. I'm here now, and the question that matters is what we do from here." She looked up at him. "But I can only help if you tell me the truth, all of it. Not the version that sounds better, the actual truth." William Carter looked at this woman. This woman who had been laughed off a public platform 4 hours ago, who had been driven to a failing ranch with nothing but the dress she was wearing and a carpetbag that held everything she owned in the world, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not like a thunderclap. The way ice changes when it starts to thaw slowly from the inside. "All right," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "All of it, from the beginning." He talked for 2 hours. And Clara listened the way her father had taught her to listen, not for the emotion, but for the facts beneath the emotion, because facts were where the real problems lived. William had inherited the ranch 3 years ago when his father died. His father had been a good cattleman, but a poor businessman, and the ranch had already been in mild debt when William took over. In the first year, trying to expand too fast, William had borrowed from the bank. In the second year, a bad winter killed 11 head of cattle and injured 3 more badly enough that they had to be sold below market value. In the third year this year, he had made the worst decision, borrowing money from Victor Langford, to cover an emergency fence repair, because the bank had stopped lending to him and he had no other options. Langford had offered the money cheerfully with a handshake and a smile. The interest rate in the paperwork was anything but cheerful. "Show me the Langford document," Clara said. William found it at the bottom of the third pile. He handed it over without looking at it himself, the way people hand over things they can't bear to look at directly. Clara read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the table and was quiet for a moment. "William." "Yeah. Did you read this before you signed it?" A long pause. "I read the first part." "Not the second part." "It was 17 pages. Yes." Clara kept her voice level, steady. "It was 17 pages because the important information was buried in the middle of page 11, where most people stop reading." She tapped the document. "The interest compounds monthly, not annually, monthly. And there is a clause that allows Langford to claim a portion of your cattle as collateral if you miss 2 consecutive payments." Silence. "How many payments have you missed?" she asked. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and felt like 3 years. 2, William said, and there it was. The real crisis. Not $600 of debt. The specific ticking dangerous crisis. Victor Langford already had the legal right, if he chose to exercise it, to walk onto this ranch and take cattle. Clara looked at the numbers again. She looked at the banknote. She looked at the feed invoice. She looked at a dozen other small documents, supply receipts, cattle records, land tax notices, and she ran the arithmetic in her head with the speed and precision her father had spent years training into her. And then she took a breath, because what she was about to say next was going to require delicacy. "You are in serious trouble," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. What Langford has done is legal, and if he calls in that clause, you will lose enough cattle to set you back another 3 years if you recover at all." William's face had gone tight and still in the way men's faces go when they are confronted with a truth they already knew but had been successfully avoiding. "However," Clara continued. He looked up. "There is a path through this. It is not easy, and it requires both of us working together, and it requires you to do exactly what I tell you when it comes to the finances without arguing with me out of pride." She met his eyes directly. "Can you do that?" Something moved across his face. A man who had been carrying a loan for 3 years being told by a woman he'd known for 4 hours that there was a way out. "What's the path?" he said. Clara turned the papers over and reached for a clean sheet. "First," she said, "we need to understand exactly what you have. Not what you owe. What you have. Because your debts are real, but so are your assets, and right now, you only know half the equation." She looked at him. "What is the current market price for your grade of cattle?" "About $18 a head in Pueblo." "And Langford's buyers pay." "He buys from ranchers in the valley at 12.13, says freight costs." "He's lying," Clara said flatly. "He's the middleman. He buys at 12 and sells in Pueblo at 18 and pockets the difference while the men who raise the cattle barely break even." She wrote the number 18 on the paper, circled it, wrote 12 below it, circled that, drew a line between them. $6 a head is Langford's profit on every single animal that moves through this valley. William stared at the paper. "I knew he was making money," he said slowly. "I didn't know it was $6 times however many head go through his operation per year," Clara said. "That is how he built his empire, William. Not through better ranching. Through controlling who sells to whom and at what price." The room was quiet. Outside wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. "So what do we do?" William said. Clara looked down at her paper. At the numbers. At the path she could see forming in her mind, narrow and difficult, and requiring more work than either of them had probably done in their lives. "We find a way to get your cattle to Pueblo ourselves," she said, "without going through Langford. And then we find a way to help the other ranchers in this valley do the same thing." She tapped her pen on the paper. "Because you are not the only man in this valley being paid $12 for an $18 animal." William was quiet for a long moment. "Langford won't like that," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "He won't. He's the most powerful man in this county. He owns the feed supplier. He has relationships with the sheriff. I know, Clara said. I understand what we'd be starting. She looked up. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it. A pause. And while you're thinking, where do you keep the cattle records? They worked until the candle burned down. Clara organized. William answered questions. Between them on the rough wooden table, a picture emerged. Not a pretty picture, not a comfortable one, but a true one, which was more valuable. By the time the work was done, Clara knew the ranch better than William did in some respects because she could see the shape of it in numbers in a way that years of living on it hadn't given him. At some point, William got up and made coffee and then made it again when the first pot went cold because neither of them had thought to drink it. He set a cup in front of her without comment, and she said, "Thank you," without looking up from the ledger, and it was in its own way the most natural exchange either of them had managed all day. When the candle finally died, Clara sat back and pressed her fingers against her eyes. "You should sleep," William said. "It's late. There are a few more. There will always be a few more," he said with the patient certainty of a man who had learned some things the hard way. "The numbers will be there in the morning. You need to rest." Clara looked at him across the table. In the darkness without the candle, she could barely see his face, just the outline of it, and the steadiness of his voice. "Where do I sleep?" she asked. "My room is yours," he said immediately. "I'll be in the barn." "William, this is your home now," he said simply. "A person ought to sleep properly in their own home." Clara was quiet. She had been preparing all day for the other version of this conversation. The version where a man who had paid money for her reminded her what that meant. She had been bracing for it so long that its absence left her oddly off balance. "Why did you do it?" she said quietly. "At the auction. You didn't know me. You didn't know what I could or couldn't do. You had $6 and change in your pocket and $600 in debt, and you spent 2 of them on a stranger. Why?" William was quiet for a long moment. "My mother," he said finally, "was a woman that people underestimated her whole life. She was sharp and capable, and she worked herself half to death on this ranch, and people in town talked about her like she was nothing, because she was a woman married to a poor rancher." He paused. "I watched it happen for years, and I never could do a thing about it. She died when I was 17. Another pause. "And then I'm standing in that crowd today watching that auctioneer laugh, watching everybody else laugh, and watching you stand there. You weren't crying. I need you to know I noticed that. You weren't crying." Clara didn't say anything. And something in me just said no. His voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. "Not today. Not this woman." The silence that settled between them after that was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of 2 people who have just exchanged something real and are giving it room to exist. "Get some sleep," William said, standing. "Tomorrow we figure out how to keep Langford from taking my cattle. Deal." Clara stood. She picked up the ledger and straightened the papers she'd organized. "Deal," she said. She had been bought for $2. She had been laughed at in front of 100 people. She had arrived at a failing ranch with nothing but a carpetbag and the math in her head. And somehow standing in a dark kitchen in a house that smelled like old coffee and hard work, she felt something she hadn't felt since her father died. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, William rode into town for feed supplies, and Clara stayed behind to finish the ledger. She was deep in the cattle records when she heard boots on the porch. She had a moment, just a flash in her chest of pure animal alarm. William had the horse. She was alone. Nobody in this valley knew her. Nobody would. The knock was sharp, deliberate, not tentative. The knock of someone who expected to be answered. Clara set down the pen. She crossed to the door and opened it. The man on the porch was perhaps 60 broad through the chest, dressed better than anyone else she'd seen in Red Hollow. His coat was dark wool, his boots were polished, and his face wore the particular smooth expression of a man who was accustomed to other people being uncomfortable around him. He smiled. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "Or I suppose Mrs. Carter now technically. I heard you arrived yesterday. I wanted to introduce myself. You have me at a disadvantage, Clara said. You know my name, and I don't know yours. Victor Langford, he said. Clara felt the name land in her chest, like a stone dropping into still water. She kept her face perfectly composed. Mr. Langford, she said. What can I do for you? Nothing at all, he said, still smiling. Just being neighborly. We do that out here in the valley, look after each other, make sure new arrivals feel welcome. He glanced past her into the house the way a man glances at something he's already decided he might want to own. How are you finding the place? We're settling in, Clara said. Good, good. He rocked back on his heels. You know William is a good man. Hard-working. Unfortunately, not always the best at the business side of things. Ranching is complicated, financial side of it especially. A pause laid very carefully. I've tried to help him out over the years. Loans here and there. That's what neighbors do. That's very generous, Clara said. Well, he shrugged modestly. Some of us are in a position to help and some of us aren't. No shame in needing help. His eyes settled on her face, assessing. I imagine a woman with your background understands that business being what it is, things not always working out the way we plan. He knew about her father. Of course he did. Men like Langford made it their business to know everything about everyone they might want leverage over. Things don't always work out the way we plan, Clara agreed evenly. But sometimes they work out better. A small shift behind his smile. So small most people would have missed it. I'm sure they do, he said. Well, I won't keep you. I'm sure you have a great deal to get used to. He turned to go, then paused as if something had just occurred to him. Oh, and Mrs. Carter. Do give William my regards and remind him that the payment schedule on our arrangement has a certain deadline coming up. I'd hate for there to be any complications. He said the word complications the way a man says a word he has used many times before and enjoyed every time. I'll tell him, Clara said. She stood in the doorway and watched Victor Langford walk to his horse, a far better horse than anything on the Carter ranch, and ride away without looking back. Then she closed the door. She stood for a moment with her hand on the door and her back to the room. So that's what he looks like, she thought. She had been expecting something. She hadn't been expecting how pleasant he was, how smooth, how carefully every word had been chosen and placed. She had met men like Langford before, men who operated in the space between what they said and what they meant. Men who were most dangerous, not when they were angry, but when they were smiling. She went back to the table, she picked up the pen, and for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Colorado, Clara Whitmore felt something she recognized from the hardest years of her life. She felt the particular cold clarity that comes when you understand fully and completely that the fight in front of you is real. All right then, she thought. All right. When William came back that afternoon, he found the kitchen empty, and Clara outside standing at the fence line that separated the ranch yard from the north pasture, looking at the cattle. He climbed down from the wagon and walked over. Something wrong, he said. Langford came this morning. William went very still. What did he? He was polite, Clara said. He reminded us about the payment deadline, wrapped in neighborly conversation, but the message was clear enough. William's jaw tightened. He looked out at the cattle. He's going to call in that clause, William said. It wasn't a question. Not yet, Clara said. If he wanted to move immediately, he wouldn't have come personally. He came to see me, to take my measure. She paused. He wanted to know if I was going to be a problem. And Clara turned to look at him. He's going to find out, she said quietly, that I am. Something moved across William Carter's face, then something she hadn't seen from him before. Not relief exactly, not quite confidence. Something that lived between those two things in the space where a man discovers that he's no longer fighting alone. He looked at her for a long moment. Good, he said simply. The wind moved through the grass. The cattle shifted. Somewhere in the distance, Red Hollow went about its business, unaware that in a rough house 6 miles east, two people who had been written off by almost everyone they knew had just made a quiet and completely serious decision to push back. The girl nobody wanted had arrived, and she had already found the enemy's weakness. Now all she needed was time. The morning after Langford's visit, Clara was up before sunrise. William found her at the table with the ledger open. 3 separate columns of numbers running down a fresh sheet of paper and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, going cold beside her elbow. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was not exactly a lie and not exactly the truth either. He poured himself coffee, sat down across from her, and waited. He was learning already that Clara Whitmore did not need to be prompted. She would speak when she was ready, and pushing before that moment was a waste of breath. She looked up after a minute. "I've been running the numbers 3 different ways," she said. "And all 3 ways come back to the same answer. If we pay Langford's next installment, we don't have enough left to cover the banknote that's due in 6 weeks. If we pay the banknote, Langford has legal grounds to start the process of claiming collateral." She tapped the paper. "He's built it so there's no safe move. Either way, we hand something over." William looked at the numbers. He could read well enough to follow what she'd written, even if the calculations themselves would have taken him 3 times as long. "So we're trapped," he said. "We're in a trap," Clara said. "Those are different things. A trap can be gotten out of. Trapped means you've stopped moving." William looked at her. "What's the difference in practice?" "The difference is this." She turned the paper and pointed to a number she had circled. 40 head of cattle at $18 each in Pueblo, not 12, not what? Langford pays the actual Pueblo price comes to $720. That clears both debts with room left over. "We can't get them to Pueblo," William said. "The only buyer who comes out this far is Langford." "I know." Clara nodded. "So we go to Pueblo." Silence. "Clara, a cattle drive to Pueblo is 3 days minimum. I need men for that. I need supplies I need." "How many other ranchers in this valley are in the same position?" she asked. He stopped. She watched him think it through. She could see the moment it connected the way a man's face changes when an idea that seemed impossible starts to take a different shape. "You're talking about combining herds," he said slowly. "I'm talking about sharing the cost of a drive," she said. 3 or 4 ranches pool their cattle. They split the expenses. They sell at Pueblo prices. Every man comes out ahead by $6 a head, which is money Langford has been taking from this valley for years. William was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the wind outside and the small settling noises of a house in the early morning. "The ranchers here are proud men," he said carefully. "They don't ask for help, and most of them don't trust each other much. Langford's kept it that way. If any one of them talks to another one about money trouble, it gets back to Langford eventually, and he uses it." "I know," Clara said, "which is why you're not going to talk to them about money trouble." She met his eyes. "You're going to talk to them about profit." Another silence. Different quality this time. "You've thought about how to approach them," William said. "Since 3 in the morning, yes." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived 24 hours ago, with nothing, who had been publicly humiliated in front of the entire town, who had every reason to sit in a corner and feel sorry for herself, and something in him shifted again. Not the same shift as the night before. Something that went a little deeper. "All right," he said. "Tell me." She told him. By the time she finished, his coffee was also cold, and the sun was fully up outside. "The nearest neighbor," he said, "is Ed Marsh, about 2 miles north. He's a stubborn old coot but fair. If Ed says yes, the others listen to Ed." He paused. "But Ed hated my father. Has opinions about our family going back 15 years. Does Ed have cattle with Langford acting as middleman?" "Everyone does. There's nobody else." "Then Ed's problem is the same as yours, and his stubbornness and his opinion about your father are less important than $6 a head." Clara stood, picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. "Can you get me a meeting with him today?" William blinked. "Today." "Time matters," she said simply. "Langford came here yesterday. That means he's paying attention to this ranch. The faster we move, the less time he has to prepare a response." William stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Clara with an expression that was hard to name exactly, something between admiration and the particular wariness of a man who is realizing that the situation he is in is moving faster than he expected, in a direction he hadn't planned for, under the navigation of someone he'd known for 36 hours. "I'll hitch the wagon," he said. She was already getting her coat. Ed Marsh's ranch was a different world from William's in terms of mood, if not in terms of money, where the Carter place had the feeling of a man who had been quietly losing ground. Marsh's had the feeling of a man who had been standing absolutely still for years and calling it strength. The fences were maintained, but nothing more. The house was clean, but nothing more. The man himself, mid-60s, square jaw, white hair, trimmed short hands, like a pair of old work gloves left out in the weather, looked at William Carter with the blank expression of someone who has decided years ago exactly what they think of a person and seen no reason since to revise. "Carter," he said. "Just the name. No greeting." "Ed," William said. "This is my wife Clara." Ed Marsh looked at Clara the way men his age and temperament looked at women who appeared in unexpected contexts, which was to say with the particular blankness that meant he was waiting for someone to explain why she was relevant. Clara did not wait for an explanation to be offered. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I'll be direct with you because I suspect you prefer that. What is the last price Langford paid you per head?" A pause. Ed Marsh's eyes moved from Clara to William and back. "That's not a normal conversation to open with," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "But it's the right one. What was the price?" Another pause. Shorter. $12.50, Ed said. "And what is the current Pueblo market price for your grade of cattle?" A longer pause this time. Ed Marsh looked at William again with an expression that was hard to read and said, "Where'd you find her?" "Red Hollow," William said. "The auction," Clara said calmly, without embarrassment and without apology. "Which is not relevant right now. The relevant number is $5.50. That is how much money Langford takes from you per animal. I'd like to discuss how to stop that." Ed Marsh was quiet for a long time. Then he opened his door wider. "Come in," he said. They sat at Ed Marsh's table for 90 minutes. Ed started skeptical, moved to suspicious, moved to thoughtful, and finished somewhere that was not quite agreement, but was considerably closer to it than anything William had hoped for walking in. The key moment came about an hour in, when Clara laid out the compound interest clause in Langford's loan agreement, the same clause buried on page 11 that William hadn't read, and Ed Marsh's face went through a series of changes that started with confusion and ended somewhere in the vicinity of cold fury. "He's got that same language in my agreement," Ed said quietly. "Almost certainly," Clara said. "I've made every payment," Ed said. "On time. Every one. I know. And as long as you do, he doesn't exercise it. But the clause exists, which means Langford can call it in whenever you miss even one payment for any reason. A bad season, a sick animal, anything." She paused. "He holds that over every rancher in this valley, Mr. Marsh. That's not lending. That's control." Ed was quiet for a moment. "My agreement says the same compound interest structure," he said. "I would need to see it to confirm, but based on what you've described about the terms, yes." Ed stood up. He went to a chest in the corner of the room. He rifled through it for a minute, pulled out a document, brought it back, and set it in front of Clara without a word. She read it. She found the clause on page 13 in this version. She looked up and met Ed Marsh's eyes. He read her expression before she said a word. "Son of a," he started, and then stopped himself and looked at Clara. "Pardon me." "Don't apologize," she said. "Be angry. Anger is appropriate here." Ed sat back down. He looked at William. "Your wife," he said. "Yeah," William said. "She always like this." "I've known her 2 days," William said. "But I'm beginning to think yes." Ed Marsh made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. He looked back at Clara. "You're talking about a joint drive to Pueblo," he said. "Carter's 40 head, my 60. Maybe pull in Tom Briggs and the Henderson brothers too if they've got enough. That's a real drive." "Yes," Clara said. "Langford will know what we're doing before we get 5 miles out," Ed said. "He's got eyes everywhere in this valley." "Yes," Clara said again. He will. So what do we do about that? Clara had been thinking about this since 4 in the morning, when the larger shape of the problem had fully revealed itself to her. We don't hide it, she said. We can't, so we don't try. She looked at Ed steadily. We move so fast he doesn't have time to stop us before it's already done. Ed Marsh looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then he nodded once slowly. How fast? He said. 4 days, Clara said. Can you be ready in 4 days? Ed blinked. I know. Can you do it? A pause. Ed Marsh, who had been in the same place for 15 years and moved at the pace of a man who trusted nothing, that moved quickly, looked at this woman he had met 90 minutes ago and calculated something that had more to do with instinct than arithmetic. 3, he said. I can do it in 3. Clara allowed herself one small controlled exhale. 3 days, she said. We'll need to contact Briggs and the Henderson brothers today. I'll ride to Briggs myself this afternoon, Ed said. He'll take it better from me than from Carter. He glanced at William without malice, just the honest acknowledgement of old history. No offense. None taken, William said, and meant it. They were back at the Carter ranch by noon. William unhitched the horse and was quiet all the way back to the barn. Clara walked beside him, also quiet. They had learned already in the compressed and accelerated way that people learn things when circumstances force them close together, that silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was working silence, thinking silence. It was at the barn door that William stopped. I need to tell you something, he said. Clara stopped. I should have told you before we went to Ed's. I didn't because I wasn't sure it mattered, but now that the drive is actually happening, it matters. She looked at him. Tell me. Langford's nephew works at the Pueblo stockyards, William said. He handles the sales records for most of the cattle that come through. If we show up with a combined herd and try to sell at market price, Langford will have 24 hours notice before we even unload the cattle. The silence stretched. Clara felt the weight of it settle onto everything they had built in the last 3 hours. 4 ranches combining herds. 3 days preparation. Ed Marsh finally moving, all of it predicated on getting to Pueblo and selling before Langford could react. And now, a nephew in the stockyards. A set of eyes that couldn't be avoided. She was quiet for a long moment. Does the nephew like his uncle? She asked. William frowned slightly. What? Langford's nephew. Does he like Langford? Are they close? Does the nephew owe him anything personally, or is it just employment? William thought about it. His name's Dale. Dale Langford. Young, maybe 25. He and Victor had a falling out a couple years back. From what I heard, something about money. Victor owed Dale's mother after Dale's father died. Victor didn't pay it. He paused. Dale still works for him because there's nothing else in Pueblo paying steady wages. But no, I don't think he much likes his uncle. Clara was quiet for another moment. Then, do you know Dale personally? I've met him twice, maybe 3 times. He's all right. Could you write him a letter tonight? She said. Not about the drive, about the clause. About what Langford has been doing to the ranchers in this valley. And about the fact that the same thing Langford did to these men's families, he did to Dale's mother. William stared at her. You want to turn Langford's own nephew, he said. I don't want to turn anyone, Clara said carefully. I want to give a young man who has his own grievances with Victor Langford accurate information and let him decide what to do with it. What he does with it is his choice. A pause. But I suspect what he does with it might be useful to us. William was still staring at her. Clara, he said slowly, I think Langford seriously underestimated you. Most people do, she said simply. It's usually their mistake, not mine. She picked up the pace back toward the house. Write the letter tonight. We'll send it with the early post tomorrow. He followed her, and somewhere behind that careful, even expression of hers, something had shifted, because this was no longer just about survival. This was no longer just about $2 silver and a failing ranch, and a woman who had nowhere else to go. This was a war. Quiet, bloodless, waged with numbers and letters, and the careful application of truth as a weapon. And Clara Whitmore, whom the whole town of Red Hollow had decided was worth less than a decent meal, was starting to understand that she had been fighting versions of this war her entire life. She had just never had a partner before. That night, William wrote the letter. Clara sat across from him and helped him find the words, not hers, but his, shaped and directed with a precision she had spent years developing. They worked slowly, carefully, because the letter had to do several things at once. Establish trust. Present facts, make no explicit request, and leave Dale Langford with a question whose only honest answer was action. When it was done, William read it back to himself. "It's good," he said quietly. "It's true," Clara said. "That's what makes it good." William folded the letter, sealed it, and set it by the door for morning. Then he looked at Clara across the table. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When you were standing on that platform, before I said anything, what were you thinking?" The question surprised her. She was quiet for a moment, because the honest answer required reaching back into a place she had been trying not to revisit. "I was thinking about my father," she said finally. "He used to say that the only thing a person truly owns is how they carry themselves when everything else is taken." She paused. "I was trying to carry myself the way he meant." William was quiet. "Did it work?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "I didn't cry, if that's what you mean." "That's not what I meant," he said. "I meant, did thinking about him help?" She considered that. "Yes," she said. "It did." They sat in the quiet for a moment. The letter was by the door. The ledger was on the table. 3 days until the drive, and somewhere out there Victor Langford had no idea what was coming. "William," Clara said. "Yeah. If this works, the drive, the cooperative, all of it, it won't fix everything at once. You understand that. It will take a long time, and there will be setbacks. I know that. And Langford will fight back. Once he realizes what's happening, he will fight back hard, and he will not be pleasant about it." She looked at him steadily. "I need to know you understand that before we go any further. Because if we start this and stop in the middle, we will be in a worse position than we are now." William met her eyes. "Clara," he said, "I spent $2 on a woman nobody wanted and invited a fight with the most powerful man in the county before I even knew what you were capable of." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Stopping in the middle was never something I was planning on." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest that cracked place. The one that had started breaking quietly on the auction platform and had been held together by sheer stubbornness ever since eased, just slightly, just enough. "All right then," she said. She picked up the ledger. He picked up his hat, and Red Hollow slept unaware while 6 miles east. Two people who had been told in 100 different ways that they didn't matter were building something that was going to matter very much indeed. The letter to Dale Langford went out on the Morning Post, and for 2 days nothing came back. Clara told herself that was fine. That was expected. A young man receiving information that upended his understanding of his own family situation was not going to respond in 48 hours. She told herself this with great confidence, while simultaneously checking the post each morning with the controlled urgency of someone who is trying very hard not to look like they are checking the post. William noticed. He didn't say anything about it, which she appreciated. What he did instead was work. The 3 days before the drive were the hardest physical work Clara had ever witnessed up close. William was up before light and moving constantly, reinforcing the cattle pen, so the combined herd could be held overnight before departure, repairing tack, organizing supplies, riding to coordinate with Ed Marsh and Tom Briggs and the Henderson brothers, who had agreed to join on Ed's word alone without ever meeting Clara and without being entirely sure what they were agreeing to. Clara's work was different, but no less relentless. She spent those same 3 days writing letters to Pueblo, not to Dale, but to the stockyard manager, establishing a selling appointment under the combined ranch names, before Langford's nephew even knew to look for them. Letters to the bank buying them 7 additional days on the note, due date, by providing a partial payment from the small reserve she had found buried in the back of the ledger. A reserve William hadn't known existed because he'd written it off as a loss 3 months ago and stopped looking at that page. And one very careful letter to a lawyer in Denver outlining the compound interest clause in Langford's loan agreements and asking a single specific legal question about whether such terms were enforceable under Colorado territorial law. She didn't tell William about the lawyer letter. Not yet. She didn't want to give him hope about a legal angle that might go nowhere. But she had learned from her father that the most important preparation is the preparation nobody sees coming. On the second evening, Ed Marsh rode over unannounced. William was still in the barn. Clara answered the door and read Ed's face before he said a word tight around the eyes. Jaw set, moving with the particular controlled speed of a man carrying bad news he hasn't decided how to deliver. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat. He put his hat on his knee and looked at her. "Langford knows," he said. The words hit the room like a stone through glass. Clara sat down across from him and kept her voice steady. "How much does he know?" "Enough. His man was at Briggs's place this morning, not Langford himself, one of the men he keeps on his payroll. Came under the pretense of checking on a fence line that borders Langford's property and ended up in Tom's barn asking questions about cattle counts." Ed's jaw tightened. Tom's not a good liar. What did Tom say? Nothing outright, but enough. The man saw the cattle were being moved toward the south pen, and that's not where Tom keeps them unless he's preparing for transport. Ed looked at his hands. "Langford will know it's a combined drive by tonight, maybe sooner." Clara was quiet for a moment. In her head, she was running through the timeline. The drive was set to leave at dawn tomorrow. The Pueblo appointment was set for the day after. If Langford moved quickly, he had roughly 18 hours to find a way to stop them. "What can he actually do?" she said. "Legally, what are his options?" Ed considered. He could call in the collateral clause tonight on William's agreement technically. That would require a legal notice, which takes time, but Langford has the sheriff on his side, and the sheriff doesn't always wait for paperwork. What else? He could block the road. He owns 2 miles of property along the main route south, and he has the legal right to refuse passage across it. Clara felt that one. The road. She hadn't fully mapped the route. "Is there an alternate route?" she said. "Longer. Adds almost a full day to the drive. But possible. Rough. Harder on the cattle. But yes, possible." "Then we take the alternate route," Clara said immediately. Ed looked at her. "That decides it for you that fast. The road problem is solvable. The clock problem is the real one." She leaned forward. "Ed, if we leave tonight instead of tomorrow morning, how much time does that buy us?" Ed blinked. "Tonight, the men aren't ready or willing." He stopped. She pressed. "The cattle are in the south pens. The supplies are mostly loaded. The coordination is done. What actually requires waiting until dawn." Ed was quiet, working through it. The particular quiet of a stubborn man, finding that someone else has outthought him and deciding whether to be annoyed about it or grateful. "Habit," he said finally. "We're waiting until dawn out of habit." "Then we leave in 3 hours," Clara said. "I'll get William." Ed Marsh stood up and put his hat back on his head, and for just a moment, just a flash, something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "You know," he said, "when Carter showed up at my door with a woman I'd never met and told me she had a plan, I thought he'd lost his mind." "And now?" Clara said. "Now I'm thinking Langford's the one who's lost something." He moved toward the door. 3 hours. I'll have my men ready." Hal was gone before Clara had fully processed the conversation. She stood for a moment in the empty kitchen alone, with the weight of what she'd just set in motion. Leaving tonight meant no sleep. It meant colder conditions on their trail. It meant the ranchers' families being woken and told to prepare in hours instead of the morning they'd planned for. It meant more chances for something to go wrong. But staying until morning meant giving Langford overnight to act. She went to the barn to find William. He was bent over a saddle strap when she came in, and he straightened and looked at her face and said without preamble, "What happened?" "Langford knows. We're leaving tonight. 3 hours." She met his eyes. "I already told Ed." William was still for exactly 2 seconds. Then he set down the strap, picked up his coat, and said, "I'll get the cattle moving." No argument. No question. No pause to consider whether she'd overstepped by making the call without him. Something in Clara's chest registered that, filed it away. They moved fast, and they moved quiet, because the kind of noise that carried across an empty valley at night was the kind that reached the wrong ears. 4 ranches worth of cattle combined into a single herd of 160 animals moving south in the dark, along a route that was longer and rougher than the main road, but that didn't pass a single inch of Langford's property. Clara rode beside William at the front of the column. She was not a natural rider. Her years had been spent in merchant offices and schoolrooms, not saddles, and every hour of that ride made itself known in her back and her legs. She said nothing about it. William knew because he watched her without appearing to, and once at the 2-hour mark, when they stopped briefly to water the herd at a creek crossing, he handed her a strip of leather to grip on the saddle without explanation. She took it without explanation. Ed Marsh rode up beside them at the water stop, and his expression was tight. "We've got a problem," he said. William straightened. "What kind?" "Henderson's youngest cattle, the ones he brought from his east pasture. 3 of them are lame. Not badly, but enough to slow the whole rear of the column." Clara and William exchanged a look. "Cut them," Clara said. Ed and William both looked at her. "Leave them at the creek. Henderson's loss is real, but 3 lame cattle slowing 160 is a cost we can't afford tonight." She held Ed's gaze. "Tell Henderson we'll compensate from the Pueblo proceeds, but we don't slow down." Ed glanced at William. "She's right," William said. Ed rode back without another word. There was a brief, tense exchange at the rear of the column that Clara could hear but not quite make out. Henderson's voice raised, then lowered, then going quiet. The herd moved on. They stopped briefly at the 4-hour mark. A short rest. Cattle-settled men eating cold food from saddlebags. Clara sat on a fence post and did arithmetic in her head to stay awake. Pueblo prices, profit margins, the lawyer's letter, and what it might mean if the compound interest clause was found to be legally questionable. Tom Briggs materialized out of the dark and sat nearby. He was a quiet man, heavy-set, slow-moving, with the kind of face that didn't give much away, and he had barely spoken to Clara directly since the drive began. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Briggs." A pause. "My agreement with Langford," he said. "Is it the same as Carter's, the compound interest?" "Almost certainly," Clara said. "I haven't seen it, but based on what you've described, yes." Another pause. Longer. "My wife's been worried for 2 years," he said. "Every time a payment comes due, she doesn't sleep the week before. I told her it was fine, that I had it under control." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't have it under control." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Briggs," she said carefully, "getting control of it starts with tonight. Getting your cattle to a fair price. Having that money to work with. After that, we talk about the agreements, the cooperative, all of it." She paused. "Your wife was right to worry, but she doesn't have to worry alone. Neither do you." Briggs was quiet. He looked at the dark ground in front of him. "My wife is going to like you," he said almost to himself. "She's going to like you a lot." He got up and walked back to the herd without another word. Clara watched him go and felt the particular weight of what was actually happening here. It wasn't just cattle and numbers and Langford and debt. It was families. It was people who had been quietly afraid for a long time and hadn't had a name for the specific thing they were afraid of. She was beginning to understand that the cooperative she'd proposed wasn't just a financial mechanism. It was something these people needed in a way that went beyond economics. Dawn found them 12 miles out from Pueblo. And that was when the rider caught up to them. He came from the north at a hard gallop, which was the wrong direction. Everything behind them was wrong direction. And every man on the drive saw him coming and knew immediately that it meant something. The cattle felt the tension move through the men and shifted nervously, and Ed Marsh had to ride wide to keep the rear of the column settled. William spurred his horse and intercepted the rider before he reached the main column. Clara followed. The rider was young, maybe 18, One of the Henderson boys' ranch hands, and he was out of breath and his horse was lathered from hard riding. "Sheriff's coming," he said. "Rode out to Ed Marsh's place an hour ago with 2 of Langford's men and a document. Ed's wife told me to ride hard." The words hit like a physical thing. "What kind of document?" Clara said. The boy shook his head. She couldn't read the whole thing, but she said it had Langford's name and William Carter's name, and she heard the sheriff say something about cattle. The collateral clause. Langford had moved overnight exactly as Clara had feared. He had filed some form of legal action, whether it was genuine or simply the kind of document that looked, but they'd have to cut across to pick up your trail, and this road. 2 hours, William said. He looked at Clara. Clara was already calculating. 12 miles to Pueblo at current pace was 3 hours. Maybe less if they pushed. If the sheriff was 2 hours behind on a different road cutting to their trail added time, it might be enough. "Push the herd," she said to William. "Pushing 160 cattle that have been moving all night." "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." William looked at her for one long moment, and what passed between them in that look was not words exactly, but something more direct. A question, "Are you sure?" and an answer, "Yes." And underneath both of those something steadier, "I trust you." He wheeled his horse and rode down the column, calling to the other men. The pace increased. The cattle protested bunching and jostling, and 3 men on the flanks worked hard to keep the column from fragmenting. Clara rode at the front and held her position, even though her body was screaming at her from the all-night ride, and she focused on the road ahead and the arithmetic in her head, and the single fact that kept her moving: they were close. They were so close. At the 1-hour mark, Tom Briggs rode up alongside her, and his face was tight. "There's a rider on the ridge," he said quietly. "Just sitting. Watching." Clara didn't turn her head. "Langford's man." "Hard to say from this distance, but he's been up there for about 10 minutes, and he's not moving." A spotter. Langford was tracking their position and feeding it to the sheriff's party. That was how he was going to cut the time gap. Clara thought fast. "William," she called. He came up beside her. "There's a spotter on the ridge," she said, "which means Langford knows exactly where we are, and the sheriff can cut across country to intercept us." "How far is the stockyard from the east entrance to Pueblo?" William thought. "The east entrance may be a mile and a half. The stockyard is on the west side of town. So if we enter from the east and move through town, we're inside Pueblo's limits before the sheriff can reach us. Once we're in town, any action he takes is subject to the town marshal's authority, not the county sheriff." "The town marshal is not in Langford's pocket," Ed said, who had appeared on Clara's other side. "I know," Clara said. "The town marshal is Martin Howell, who had his own dispute with Langford 3 years ago over a land claim. I looked it up in the county records while I was in the ledger." She looked at William. "If we get into Pueblo, we're under Howell's jurisdiction, and the sheriff's document becomes significantly more complicated to execute." William stared at her. "You looked up the town marshal's history with Langford." "At 3 in the morning on the second night," she said. "I had time." He shook his head once slowly in the way people shake their heads when they are not actually disagreeing with anything. "East entrance," he said. He pulled his horse around. "Ed, take the rear. We're swinging east." The change in direction added 40 minutes to the drive. 40 minutes of hard-pushed cattle on tired legs, men riding with their heads turning constantly to check the ridge, the back trail, the horizon. Clara rode and did not look behind her. Looking behind was for later. Right now, there was only forward. They came into Pueblo from the east with the late morning sun at their backs and 160 cattle raising enough dust to announce them to the whole town, which was fine. Fine. Let the whole town see. Let every set of eyes in Pueblo see a combined cattle drive coming in from the valley ranches, because witnesses were exactly what they needed. The town marshal, a compact gray-haired man named Howell, who was standing outside the marshal's office as if he'd been expecting something of interest, watched the column come through with an expression of calm assessment. William rode up to him directly. "Marshal Howell, William Carter. We've got a combined drive from 4 ranches, Marsh, Carter, Briggs, Henderson. We have a selling appointment at the stockyard, and we expect we may have some company from the county sheriff within the hour." Howell looked at the cattle. He looked at William. He looked at Clara, who had ridden up alongside. "Mrs. Carter," he said, which meant he already knew who she was, which meant news traveled faster than cattle. "I heard about the cooperative idea. Good thinking." Clara kept her expression even. "Thank you, Marshal." "What's the sheriff bringing?" "A document related to a loan agreement," Clara said. "We believe it's a collateral claim filed by Victor Langford." Howell's expression didn't change exactly, but something hardened behind it. "Get your cattle to the stockyard," he said. "I'll be there when the sheriff arrives." They moved. The stockyard appointment held. The buyer was present, the scales were ready, and the price held at market rate $18 a head, every animal clean and clear. Clara stood at the edge of the stockyard and watched it happen. 160 cattle moving through the pens. Numbers going into a ledger. Real money, real prices, real value for men who had been paid $12 a head for years and called it fair because they had no alternative. She watched it and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since her father's business failed. Something that was not quite triumph. They weren't finished, not by a long way, but was closer to it than anything she'd experienced in a long time. The sheriff arrived 45 minutes later. He arrived with 2 of Langford's men and a document and a face full of the particular authority of a man who expects obstacles to get out of his way. He found Marshal Howell waiting at the stockyard gate, and behind Howell William Carter, and behind William Ed Marsh, and Tom Briggs, and both Henderson brothers. And the cattle were already sold. The transaction was complete. The money was in process. There was nothing in Langford's document, whatever it said, however it was worded, that could undo a completed legal sale in a different county. The sheriff knew it the moment he looked at the paperwork Howell held out to him. Clara watched it happen in the sheriff's face, the shift from authority to calculation, to the specific kind of cold anger that comes when a man realizes he has been outmaneuvered and has no immediate recourse. "This isn't over," the sheriff said. "No," Howell agreed pleasantly. "But today it is." The sheriff left. Langford's 2 men left with him. And in the stockyard of Pueblo, Colorado, 4 groups of ranchers, who had ridden all night on bad roads with tired cattle, turned and looked at each other with the particular expression of people who have done something together that none of them could have done alone. Ed Marsh walked up to William and held out his hand. William shook it. Then Ed turned to Clara and held out his hand. She shook it too. "Well," Ed said, "what do we do now?" Clara looked at him. She looked at the other men. She looked at William, who was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize, that quiet, steady look that said he already knew what she was going to say and was waiting to hear her say it. "Now," she said, "we go home, and we start making this permanent." Ed nodded once. "Then let's go home," he said. They rode back that evening in a different kind of quiet than they'd left in, not the tense, watchful silence of men moving through danger, but the slower, settled quiet of people who are tired and have earned the right to be tired. The kind of quiet that sits easy. William rode beside Clara, and at some point, without either of them saying anything about it, their horses drifted close enough that their stirrups were nearly touching, and neither of them moved apart. He spoke after a long while. "The letter to Dale Langford," he said. "We never heard back." We will," Clara said. "How do you know?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. "Because the truth about what his uncle did to his mother is in that letter," she said. "And the truth has a way of doing what you need it to do eventually. You just have to give it time." William was quiet. "And if it doesn't," he said. "Then we find another way," she said simply. He looked at her, then really looked in the fading afternoon light on a rough road in Colorado, with dust on both of them, and exhaustion in every line of his body, and what he saw was something he hadn't let himself think about too directly yet, because the situation had been moving too fast, and there had been too much to do. He saw a woman who was quietly and without fanfare extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way that people talked about in books or songs. Extraordinary in the specific, real, and somewhat breathtaking way of a person who is exactly equal to every hard thing in front of them. Not because nothing frightens them, but because they move through the fear anyway. He looked away before she could read it in his face. But Clara had already seen it. She didn't say anything. She filed it in the same careful place she had been filing other small significant things: his apology at the auction, the leather strap on the saddle, the way he said she's right to Ed without hesitation. She wrote on. And Victor Langford, in his large house in Red Hollow, was reading a report from the sheriff and understanding for the first time that the woman on the Carter Ranch was not going to be easy to remove. He was not accustomed to that feeling. I didn't like it at all. And when Victor Langford didn't like something, he did not simply accept it. He made plans. Langford's first move came 3 days after they returned from Pueblo. It didn't look like a move. That was the thing about Langford: his most dangerous actions never announced themselves. They arrived dressed as something else entirely. It came in the form of a notice posted at the Red Hollow General Store, which was also the town's informal message board, mail distribution point, and the place where every rancher in the valley eventually appeared at least once a week. The notice was printed, not handwritten, which meant Langford had sent to the county seat for it, which meant he had been planning it before the drive even left. William brought it home and set it on the table without a word. Clara read it. It was a formal announcement of a new fee structure from the Red Hollow Feed and Supply Company, which Langford owned outright. Effective immediately, any ranch that was not a current client in good standing with Langford's brokerage operation would pay a 40% premium on all feed and supply purchases. 40%. Clara set the notice down. She picked it up again and read the fine print. Current client in good standing, she said aloud. Meaning anyone who sells through him, William said. He was standing by the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. Anyone who went to Pueblo Marsh Briggs the Hendersons, they're no longer clients in good standing. He'll apply this to all of us. He can do that legally, Clara said. It's his store. He can charge what he wants. Clara was quiet for a moment. Is there another feed supplier within reasonable distance? Nearest one is in Pueblo, which means freight costs that eat up the savings. William looked at her. He thought of that. Of course he did, Clara said. She was already running through the angles, but this one was tighter than the road problem or the collateral clause. Feed and supplies were not optional. You could reroute cattle. You couldn't unfeed them. He's not trying to bankrupt us immediately. He's trying to make the cooperative too expensive to maintain. It might work, William said. It wasn't defeat in his voice, just honesty, the particular honesty of a man who has learned that pretending a problem is smaller than it is makes it harder to solve. It might, Clara agreed, if we let it. She stood up. I need to talk to Ed. Clara, it's almost dark. Then I'll talk to him in the dark. She picked up her coat. William Langford is moving fast because he's scared. Scared men make mistakes. We need to move faster. He handed her his better coat instead of hers, heavier, warmer, without making anything of it. She put it on and didn't make anything of it either. Ed Marsh listened to the feed notice with the expression of a man absorbing a blow he half expected. When Clara finished explaining, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said simply, "What do you need?" "A meeting. Every rancher who went to Pueblo plus anyone else in this valley who's been buying from Langford's store. 3 days from now." She looked at him. "I need you to call it Ed. Not William, not me. You. Because these men listen to you. And right now, they're going to be scared. And scared men need to hear from someone they already trust." Ed was quiet. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've thought about almost nothing else for 3 days," she said. He nodded. 3 days. I'll get word out tomorrow." She was back at the Carter Ranch before full dark. William had made food, real food, not just coffee and cold biscuits, actual food, and he set it in front of her when she came in without asking whether she was hungry, because he had learned that Clara forgot to eat when she was working through a problem, and that reminding her verbally accomplished nothing. She ate. She thought. She talked through the feed problem out loud, using William as a sounding board in the way she had come to rely on over these past weeks. Not because he always had answers, but because the act of saying things out loud to someone who listened carefully helped her find the shape of ideas she couldn't quite see from inside her own head. "The cooperative needs to buy its own supplies," she said. "Collectively. If we pool purchasing the same way we pooled the cattle drive, we can order from Pueblo in volume and split the freight cost. The numbers work if there are enough ranches involved." She paused. 7 ranches makes the math work. We currently have 4 committed. "Who else?" William said. "Patterson, the Muller family. Old Sims if we can get through to him." She tapped the table. "And there's the Grady place, Frank Grady, west of Marsh. He's been struggling longest of anyone from what Ed told me." "Grady is complicated," William said carefully. "How complicated? He owes Langford more than anyone. He's also the most afraid, and Langford knows it." William paused. "If Langford can keep Grady out of the cooperative, or worse, use Grady as a source of information, it could be a problem." Clara absorbed that. "Has Grady ever crossed Langford?" "Never. Not once." "Is that because he supports Langford, or because he's afraid of him?" William thought. "Fear," he said. "Definitely fear." "Then he's not Langford's man," Clara said. "He's Langford's hostage. There's a difference." She made the note. "I'll talk to Grady myself." Clara. "I'll be careful." She looked up. "But William, if Grady comes in, we have the numbers. 7 ranches. The cooperative becomes real, sustainable. Not just one cattle drive, but an actual structure." He held her gaze. "And Langford," he said. "He's not going to watch 7 ranches organize against him and do nothing." "No," she said. "He's going to do something significant. I'm counting on it." He frowned. "You want him to act. I want him to overact," she said. "Langford has been running this valley through quiet pressure loan terms. Price control the threat of that collateral clause. He's never had to do anything dramatic because no one has ever pushed back hard enough to require it." She met William's eyes. "The moment he does something dramatic, something visible, something that the other ranchers can see clearly, that's when he loses the thing that actually keeps his power in place. Which is, the belief that he's inevitable," she said. "That there's no point fighting him. That's not really power, William. It's the illusion of power. And illusions break when you shine enough light on them." William was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with that expression she had come to know, the one that wasn't quite amazement, but lived in the same territory. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. "My father," she said. "And 2 years of watching creditors dismantle everything he built." She looked down at her notes. "He taught me the numbers. The rest I learned from watching what happens when the numbers go wrong." The meeting was held in Ed Marsh's barn 3 days later, which was big enough to hold 20 men and their various degrees of stubbornness. They came. All of them. Briggs the Hendersons, Patterson the Muller brothers, Old Sims, and in the back quiet, and apart from the others, Frank Grady. He sat with his hat in his hands, and his eyes moving from person to person, with the watchful wariness of a man who had learned that rooms full of other men's decisions usually ended badly for him personally. Clara had asked William to let her speak first. He had agreed without hesitation, which still surprised her slightly every time it happened. She stood in front of these men, farmers and ranchers, most of them older than her, all of them carrying years of hard work and private worry, and she didn't open with numbers. She had thought about opening with numbers because numbers were where she was most comfortable, but she had realized the night before that numbers were not what this room needed right now. "How many of you," she said, "have told your wife that things are fine when they weren't?" Silence. A few men shifted. Someone coughed. "How many of you have looked at your children and done that calculation? The one where you figure out how long you can hold on before you have to tell them the truth." More silence, but a different quality of silence. "Langford's power in this valley is not his money," she said. "It's your silence. Each of you alone carrying a weight that you think is only yours. Afraid to say anything because saying it out loud means admitting that the situation is worse than you've been pretending." She looked around the room, meeting eyes. "That's what he's built here. Not a business. A system that runs on your isolation from each other." Frank Grady in the back had gone very still. "The feed notice is a test," Clara continued. "He wants to see whether you'll go back to him rather than find another way. And if you do, he wins not just this round, but every round after it, because you'll have shown him that you can be moved by pressure, and that you don't have anything to come back to. She paused. But if you don't go back, if you build something that buys you out of his supply chain, the same way we bought the Pueblo Drive out of his brokerage, then the test fails. And a man whose test fails is a man who has to try something else, something louder, something the whole county can see. Tom Briggs said, and when he tries that something louder, then we're ready for it, Clara said. And so is the town marshal. And so is the lawyer in Denver who is currently reviewing Victor Langford's loan agreements under Colorado territorial law. The room went very quiet. There's a lawyer looking at the agreements, Ed said. There is, Clara said. I wrote to him 3 weeks ago. I received his first response last week. She reached into her coat and produced the letter single-page formal, written in the precise language of a Denver attorney who had spent 2 days reviewing a loan clause and arrived at a measured but unmistakable conclusion. She read the relevant section aloud. The compound interest structure as written, combined with the collateral clause trigger mechanism, potentially represented a form of predatory contracting that fell outside the standards of fair dealing established under Colorado territorial statutes. Potentially. Lawyers said potentially the way other people said certainly. The room absorbed this. Old Sims, who had not spoken yet, said quietly, he could go to jail. That determination would be for a court, Clara said carefully. What we know is that the agreements may not be legally enforceable as written, which means the debt you owe Langford may be significantly less than what his paperwork says. That landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples moved visibly across 20 men's faces. Frank Grady stood up. Everyone looked at him. He was a large man, heavy-set, with the kind of face that showed every year of hard weather and harder worry. He stood with his hat still in his hands, and he looked at Clara, and his voice, when it came, was low and rough. I've been paying Langford for 4 years, he said. More than I borrowed. I calculated it once and stopped because the number made me sick. He stopped, swallowed. My wife cried last month for the first time since our boy was born. She never cries. She's the strongest person I know. His jaw worked. She cried because she didn't know how we were going to make it through the winter. The room was completely silent. What do you need from me? He said. To Clara. Directly. Clara held his gaze. Your membership in the cooperative, she said. Your voice in this room. And whatever documentation you have of your payments to Langford going back as far as you can find. Grady nodded once slowly. You'll have all of it, he said, and sat back down. That was the moment the room changed. Clara felt it, the actual physical shift in the air of the space, the way a dozen men straightened slightly, looked at each other differently, reached some private internal conclusion that was visible in their posture before it was visible in their faces. Ed Marsh said, All right, let's talk about the supply structure. They talked for 2 hours. By the time it was done, 7 ranches had committed to the cooperative supply purchasing agreement, and Frank Grady had agreed to bring his payment documentation to Clara within the week. The numbers worked. Barely, but they worked. William rode home beside Clara in the dark, and after a mile of silence he said, Frank Grady. What about him? You knew he'd stand up. I thought he might, she said. A man who is afraid isn't a man without courage. He's a man whose courage is waiting for the right moment. She paused. I just needed to make sure the right moment was tonight. How did you know the story about his wife would do it? I didn't know, she said. I gave him space to say something true. What he said was his own. William absorbed that. Then, Clara, the lawyer's letter. You said potentially. Yes. How potentially is potentially? A pause. The lawyer was being careful because lawyers are careful, she said. But his private language in the letter was considerably less tentative than the language he'd put in writing. She glanced at William. He thinks we have a strong case. Why didn't you say that in the room? Because hope is a dangerous thing if you give people too much of it before you've secured the foundation, she said. I gave them enough to stand on, not enough to fly with before they're ready. William shook his head in the way that was becoming familiar. The slow, wondering shake that was not disagreement. I need to ask you something, he said. His voice had shifted. Quieter. Ask. The night we got back from Pueblo. You were sitting outside, and I asked if you were all right, and you said yes. Were you? Clara was quiet for a moment. Not entirely, she said. What was wrong? She thought about how to say it. I had a moment, she said carefully, of understanding how far this had come. When I was standing on that platform in Red Hollow, I was thinking about surviving the next hour. Just that. Just the next hour. She paused. And then I'm standing in a Pueblo stockyard, watching 4 ranches cattle sell at fair price, and a town marshal standing down a county sheriff, and I realized that somewhere between those 2 moments, something had changed. Another pause. I didn't know how to feel about it yet. William was quiet. Good change or bad change, he said. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Change, I think, is just change until enough time passes to know what it is. He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that Clara thought the conversation was done. Then he said, My mother used to say that the hardest thing in the world is to let yourself believe that something good is actually happening. That your instinct is always to wait for it to be taken away. Clara looked at him. Was she right? She said. Yes, he said. She was almost always right. They rode in silence for a while. Then Clara said quietly, What was she like? And William talked. Not for the first time he had mentioned his mother in fragments in passing, but this was different. This was real, the way conversations become real late at night on a quiet road when the pretending is too tiring to keep up. He talked about her laugh about the way she ran the ranch books, because his father couldn't be trusted with numbers about the way she read aloud in the evenings from whatever book she could get her hands on. About how she made everyone around her feel like they were capable of more than they knew. Clara listened. And somewhere in that listening, without either of them naming it, something shifted between them that had been building since $2 silver hit an auctioneer's table. They were half a mile from home when the rider appeared. He came fast from the direction of Red Hollow, not a gallop, but close, urgent enough to mean something, and William pulled up and waited. The rider was one of the Henderson boys. He was breathing hard, and his face was tight. What happened? William said. Someone cut your north fence, the boy said. 3 sections, and there's cattle missing, looks like maybe 8-10 head gone through the gap. William's jaw went rigid. Clara's went calm, the specific, deliberate calm that is the opposite of panic. When was it found? She said. An hour ago. My pa was riding your fence line because you asked us to watch it, and he saw the cuts. Fresh cuts. Wire cutters, not weather. Wire cutters. Not an accident. Not wear. A deliberate act. Langford's response to the meeting. Faster than she'd expected. More direct. How many head total? She asked. Can't be sure yet. 8 minimum. Maybe 12. 12 head at $18 was $216. Real money. Painful money, especially this close after the drive. William said very quietly, I'll ride out. We'll ride out, Clara said. He looked at her. It's dark, Clara, and whoever did this might still be on our land, she said steadily. Which is exactly why you're not going alone. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. They rode to the north fence with the Henderson boy leading the way, and William found the cuts exactly as described. 3 sections of fence wire cleanly snipped. No question about intent. The ground near the gap was churned with hoof prints, some of them shod horse prints mixed in with the cattle tracks, which meant someone had been there to drive the cattle through deliberately, not just leave a gap and wait. This was not opportunism. It was orchestration. William crouched near the tracks, reading them the way a man reads a familiar language. 4 horses. Horses, he said. Maybe 5. They drove them northeast. He stood. That direction takes them onto Langford's back property within 3 miles. Clara said, Don't go after them tonight. William turned to look at her. Those are my cattle, he said, and the control in his voice was the particular control of a man holding something back by main force. I know, she said. And if you ride onto Langford's property tonight to retrieve them, he will have you arrested for trespassing by morning, and everything we've built in the last 3 weeks becomes secondary to a legal fight we can't afford. She held his gaze. The cattle are painful to lose, but they're not worth the cooperative. They're not worth the lawyer case. They're not worth what we're building. He stood very still. The Henderson boy stayed back wisely, letting this be between them. "Clara," William said. "I know," she said again, softer this time. "I know how much they matter. I know." A long silence. "Then what do we do?" he said. "We document it," she said. "We have the Henderson boy as a witness. We ride to the marshal first thing tomorrow, not the county sheriff, the town marshal, and we file a report. We have the lawyer send a letter about the fence cutting as potential retaliation for a legal dispute. We make Langford's response to the meeting part of the public record." She paused. "He just handed us something, William. Evidence. That he moves against people who organize. That he uses intimidation and property damage to maintain control." Another pause. "That is exactly the kind of dramatic visible action I told you I was waiting for." William looked at her for a long, long moment. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm frightened," she said, which was the honest truth. But fear and afraid are different things. Afraid means you stop. Frightened means you know the stakes. She looked at him steadily. "I know the stakes." He held her gaze. Something in his face, all that controlled, careful private man, opened slightly. Not completely, but enough. "Okay," he said. "We do it your way." He turned to the Henderson boy. "Stay and watch the gap tonight. Make sure no one comes back. I'll send someone to relieve you in 3 hours." The boy nodded. They rode back. At the house, William fixed the fence gap in the dark methodically because he needed to do something with his hands. Clara sat on the porch step and wrote in the ledger, not numbers this time, but a careful dated account of what had been found, what the tracks showed, who had witnessed it. Her handwriting was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who has learned that clarity and documentation is its own form of power. When William came back from the fence, he sat beside her on the step. Not inside, just there in the night air, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him after hard work. "The letter to Dale Langford," he said. "I know," she said. "It's been 3 weeks." "I know." He was quiet. Then, "What if it doesn't come?" Before she could answer, she heard the sound of a horse coming up the road. Not hard riding, not urgent. Just steady, purposeful. William stood. A rider came into the yard. He sat his horse for a moment, and in the dark, Clara could make out only that he was young, and that he was alone, and that he was holding something in his hand. "Are you Mrs. Carter?" he said. "I am," Clara said. He held out the envelope. "My name is Dale Langford," he said. "I've been trying to decide for 3 weeks whether to come. I rode past twice and turned back." He paused. "Your letter about my mother, and what my uncle did." Another pause longer. "It's all true. I know it's true because my mother told me something similar 2 years ago, and I didn't want to believe it." His voice held the particular roughness of a young man who is not accustomed to emotion getting into his throat. "I have records, stockyard records, every sale that came through from this valley for the last 4 years, what Langford paid the ranchers, what the cattle actually sold for." He stopped. "I brought copies." Clara stared at him. "Come inside," she said. William was already holding the door. Dale Langford came in. He sat at the rough wooden table where Clara had organized the first ledger on the first night, and he opened a leather satchel, and he laid out 4 years of stockyard records, and in those records was the complete, documented, irrefutable evidence of exactly what Victor Langford had been doing to an entire valley. Not potentially. Not possibly. Exactly. Clara sat across from him and looked at the numbers, the real numbers, the ones Langford had never intended anyone to see, and she felt the room go very quiet and very clear. "Dale," she said carefully, "do you understand what you're handing over?" "Yes," he said. "This will end your employment. Your uncle will know it was you." "I know." "Are you prepared for that?" He looked at her across the table. He had his uncle's cheekbones slightly, and nothing else in common with the man. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, My mother worked herself half to death for 15 years because my uncle decided her husband's estate wasn't worth paying out. He paused. I've been looking at these numbers every single day. I just needed someone to send them to. He looked at the papers between them. Your letter was the first time anyone in this valley gave me a reason to believe it would actually matter. Clara looked at William. William looked back, and in that look, wordless, quick, complete, past everything that needed to be said. That the $2 were never really about a transaction. That what happened at that auction platform had set off a chain of events that led to this table. These papers, this young man who had been waiting for someone to show up and make it mean something. Clara picked up a pen. All right, she said. Let's start from the beginning. Dale Langford stayed at the Carter Ranch until past midnight. By the time he left, Clara had organized his 4 years of stockyard records into a structure that told a story any judge in Colorado territory could follow in under 10 minutes. Column by column, sale by sale. The gap between what Langford paid the ranchers and what the cattle actually sold for in Pueblo documented, dated, signed by the stockyard's own clerks, completely irrefutable. William walked Dale to his horse, and at the door, Clara heard the young man say quietly, "My mother's going to cry when I tell her." And William said just as quietly, "Let her. She's earned it." When William came back inside, Clara was still at the table. The records were stacked in order. Her notes were beside them. The room was the same rough kitchen it had always been, but it felt different. Charged the way air feels before a storm when everything is still and full of what's about to happen. William sat across from her. "How long?" he said. "Until we can take this to court." "Months," she said. "The legal process is slow. Langford will fight it." She looked at him. "But there's something that doesn't have to wait months." "What?" "The ranchers in this valley," she said. "They need to see these records, not read about them in a legal brief 6 months from now. They need to see them now. They need to know what was taken from them, specifically with their names attached." She tapped the stack. "I want to call another meeting, this week. And I want to show every man in that valley exactly how much Victor Langford stole from him year by year, animal by animal." William looked at the records. "That's not just a business meeting," he said slowly. "No," Clara said. "It's not." He understood what she meant. Showing those records to those men wasn't just information. It was ignition. It was the difference between men who were quietly angry and men who understood in specific dollar amounts with their own names on them the precise shape of what had been done to their families. "Ed needs to see this first," William said. "Tonight," Clara agreed. He looked at her. "It's past midnight." "Ed would want tonight," she said simply. "He would." And he did. Ed Marsh opened his door at 1 a.m, took one look at their faces and said, "Come in." He did not ask what time it was. He made coffee he didn't need, and sat at his table, and went through the records with the slow, methodical focus of a man who has waited a long time for something and intends to miss nothing now that it's arrived. He turned pages in silence for 20 minutes. Clara and William sat across from him and let him read. When he set the last page down, he was quiet for a long time. $6 a head, he said. "Yes." "Every head I've sold in 4 years." "Yes." He calculated something in his head. Clara knew what he was calculating. She had already done the same arithmetic for every rancher in the cooperative. "That's—" He stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges. "That's my son's education," he said, very quietly. "I couldn't send him because there wasn't enough. 4 years of $6 a head, and there was never quite enough." He set his hand flat on the records. That's where it went. The room was still. William said nothing because there was nothing to say that would help. Clara said, "We can't get those years back, but we can make sure there are no more years like them." Ed looked at her. "When's the meeting?" he said. 3 days, she said. "Can you get everyone there?" "I'll get everyone there," he said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact delivered by a man who has found his footing. They rode home as the first gray light of pre-dawn touched the eastern sky. Clara was exhausted in a way that went past physical, bone-deep soul. Deep, the exhaustion of someone who has been running on urgency for weeks and can feel it starting to thin. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. Something solid. William pulled up at the house and helped her down from the horse, and for a moment they stood close in the gray dawn light, and neither of them moved away. "You should sleep," he said. Same thing he'd said the first night, but it sounded different now 3 weeks later. Softer, more careful. "I will," she said. She looked up at him. "William." "Yeah. What we're doing, the cooperative, the legal case, all of it, it's right. I want you to know I'm certain of that. Not just strategically, morally." She held his gaze. What Langford did to these people was wrong, and exposing it is the right thing regardless of what it costs us. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I've known that since you sat down with those ledgers the first night." A pause. "I just needed to hear you say it out loud." She nodded. She turned toward the house. "Clara." She stopped. She turned back. He was looking at her with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say something that cost him something to say. "I need you to know," he said carefully, "that whatever happens with the court case and Langford and all of it, this ranch is yours. Not because of $2, not because of the auction. Because you've built something here that didn't exist before you came, and that makes it as much yours as mine." He paused. "More, maybe." Clara felt the words land somewhere she hadn't been expecting. She had been prepared for a great many things since arriving in Red Hollow. She had not been prepared for this, for the specific quiet dignity of being told that you belong somewhere, not out of obligation, but out of truth. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But it was what she had, and she meant it completely. She went inside. She did not sleep immediately. She sat by the window in the first light and let herself feel fully what she usually kept. Carefully manage the weight of the last 3 weeks, the auction platform, the $2 silver, the ledger. On the first night, Langford at the door with his polished boots and his measured threats. Ed Marsh's voice saying, "That's my son's education." Dale sitting across the table with 4 years of records and a question he'd been waiting to answer. She let herself feel all of it. And then she picked up her pen and wrote to the Denver lawyer, and this time her letter was not cautious. This time it had Dale Langford's records attached, and it asked for a court date, and it was not tentative about anything. The meeting 3 days later was different from the first two. The first meeting had been about possibility. The second about commitment. This one held again in Ed Marsh's barn, with more men than before, because word had traveled in the way that significant things travel in small valleys. This meeting was about truth. Clara laid the records on a table at the front of the room, and she went through them methodically. Ranch by ranch, name by name, year by year. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She simply presented what was there in the careful, precise way her father had taught her to present numbers, because numbers stated plainly are their own argument. The room's temperature changed as she talked. Not with noise, there was very little noise. The men were quiet in the way men go quiet when they are feeling something they don't have immediate language for. Frank Grady in the third row had his hands clasped in front of him, and his knuckles were white. When Clara reached the section of records that pertained to his ranch 4 years of sales, the specific dollar difference between what he received and what the cattle actually sold for. He made a sound very low in his chest that was not quite a word, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Tom Briggs had a piece of paper and was writing his own numbers as Clara talked, doing his personal calculation. The Muller brothers, 2 of them, solid quiet men, who had never said much in any meeting, were looking at each other across the row with an expression that was completely legible. When Clara finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then, one of the younger ranchers in the back, a man named Cole Patterson, 28 years old, who had taken over his father's failing spread 2 years ago and had been barely keeping his head above water since stood up. "What do we do?" he said. Not angry, not defeated. Just direct the way young men are direct when they've stopped being confused about which direction the problem is in. 3 things, Clara said. First, the cooperative continues. Every rancher in this room commits to the joint supply purchasing agreement, which removes Langford's ability to price gouge your feed costs. Second, any rancher who has documentation of their transactions with Langford provides copies to the Denver lawyer handling the legal case. Third, she paused. Third, we stop being quiet about what he's done. What does that mean practically? Ed said. It means we talk, Clara said. Not just to each other, to the county seat, to the territorial newspaper in Denver, to anyone with a platform and an interest in how business is conducted in Colorado territory. She looked around the room. Langford's power depends on this staying local and quiet. The moment it becomes a story that travels beyond this valley, he loses the ability to manage it. Patterson said, he'll come after whoever talks publicly. He'll try, Clara agreed, which is why no one person carries the story alone. If 20 men from this valley are all saying the same thing with documentation to back it up, there is no single target. The room was quiet. Then Ed Marsh stood up. I'm in, he said. Tom Briggs, in. Grady, in. Said quietly but without hesitation. Patterson, in. One by one, around the room, with no theatrics and no speeches. Just men looking at each other and making a decision that cost them something and was worth it. Every rancher in that barn said yes. Clara stood at the front of the room and kept her face composed, because the feeling moving through her chest was not something she wanted to manage in public. William, standing to the side, watched it happen and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. That night at the kitchen table, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Clara and looked at her with an expression she had learned to read by now. The expression that meant he was going to say something real, and he was finding the right words for it. Can I ask you something? He said. You always can. When we were in that barn tonight, did you know it would go that way? She thought about it honestly. I knew it could, she said. I didn't know it would. There's a difference between building the conditions for something to happen and controlling whether it does. She looked at her coffee. People surprise you, sometimes badly, sometimes... She stopped. Sometimes like tonight, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something, he said. And I need you to let me finish it before you say anything. She looked up. He met her eyes, and the careful private man, who had been managing his own feelings with the same discipline she managed her own, was very deliberately setting that management aside. 3 weeks ago, I had $6 and a failing ranch and a reputation in this town as the man who couldn't make his father's place work, he said. I went to that auction because I needed a wife, and I couldn't afford a proper courtship, and the practical situation required it. He paused. That was why I went. That's the honest truth. Another pause. But that's not why I put the $2 on the table. Clara waited. I put them on the table because I watched you stand on that platform for 20 minutes while people laughed and you did not move. Not your face, not your posture, nothing. And I thought... He stopped. Tried again. I thought that whatever that woman has inside her, it's something I've only ever seen once before in my life. And the only other person I ever saw carry herself like that in the middle of something that terrible was my mother. He looked at her steadily. And I made my mother a promise at her grave that I would not stand by and watch what happened to her happen to another woman if I had any ability to stop it. The room was very quiet. That's why the $2, he said. That's the whole truth of it. Clara was still for a long moment. William, she said. Yeah. Your mother would have liked what you've built here. He looked at her. We, he said. What we've built. She held his gaze. We, she agreed. Something passed between them in that moment. Not a declaration, not a dramatic pronouncement. Something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. The recognition between two people who have been through something real together that they could not have survived alone, and who have arrived without quite planning it, at the understanding that they do not intend to go back to being alone. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand and held his back. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them needed to. Langford's response to the public exposure came in 2 waves, and Clara had been right that he would overreach. The first wave was legal injunctions, counter-filings. A letter from his own Denver lawyer that was aggressive in its language and thin in its substance. Clara forwarded everything to their lawyer, who responded in the measured, devastating way of a man who has a table full of documented evidence and is not particularly worried. The second wave was social, and it was uglier. Langford began a quiet campaign in Red Hollow to discredit Clara specifically, her background, her father's failed business, the circumstances of her arrival in town. The auction. The $2. He wanted the town to see her as a desperate woman playing at business, manipulating a simple rancher for her own survival. Clara found out about the campaign from the general store owner's wife, a woman named Agnes, who came to the ranch specifically to tell her, and whose expression when she arrived carried the particular apology of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. "I thought you should know," Agnes said, "what he's saying about you." "Thank you," Clara said. "Does it—" Agnes hesitated. "Does it bother you what people are saying?" Clara thought about that honestly. "Yes," she said. "Anyone who says words about them don't matter is lying. They matter." She looked at Agnes steadily. "But they matter less than what's actually true. And what's actually true is in a courthouse file in Denver with 4 years of stockyard records attached to it." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. "My husband has been buying feed from Langford's store for 11 years, she said. "We're not ranchers, but he supplies the store." A pause. "What would joining the cooperative look like for someone like us?" Clara smiled. The first full, unguarded smile Agnes had seen from her. "Sit down," Clara said. "Let me show you." The legal case moved faster than Clara had dared to hope. The Denver lawyer, a man named Reeves, who turned out to be considerably more aggressive in a courtroom than his measured letters suggested, filed the formal complaint 6 weeks after Dale's records arrived. The compound interest clause, combined with the documented evidence of the gap between Langford's payments to ranchers and actual Pueblo market prices, constituted 2 separate legal violations. The territorial court agreed to hear the case within 90 days. The news traveled through Red Hollow in hours. William was at the feed store the cooperative had organized its own supply run, but he needed nails which weren't part of the bulk order when he heard 2 men talking about it near the counter. They didn't know he was behind the shelf. He heard his name, then Clara's name, then Langford's, then the word courthouse, spoken in the tone people use when they are saying something they haven't fully decided whether to believe yet. He paid for his nails and rode home and told Clara. She read the confirmation letter from Reeves for the 3rd time since it had arrived that morning. 90 days, she said. "Is that good?" William said. "It's very good," she said. He thought it would be 6 months minimum. She set the letter down. "Langford is going to try to settle before it gets to court." Why? Because a court case means public record, means every detail of what he's been doing gets entered into official documentation that anyone can read. She looked at William. A settlement means he pays something everyone agrees to be quiet, and he keeps most of his operation intact. She paused. "He will make an offer. And when he does, we'll listen to it," she said. "And then we'll tell him no." William raised an eyebrow. "You're sure? A settlement helps Langford more than it helps this valley," she said. "The ranchers here don't just need money back. They need the structure that was used against them to be publicly dismantled so it can't be rebuilt under a different name." She met his eyes. "I know what I'm asking for when I say we turn down a settlement. It means months more of this. It means Langford keeps making things difficult. It means—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. "I trust you," he said, simply, completely. She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. The settlement offer came 4 weeks later, delivered by Langford's lawyer to Reeves. It was substantial more than Clara had expected, which told her that Langford's own lawyers had looked at the evidence and told him the truth about his chances. The offer would have paid back a portion of the excess charges to each affected rancher and included a provision restructuring the loan agreements. Clara read it carefully. She ran the numbers. She consulted with Ed Marsh and Tom Briggs and Frank Grady, and then she wrote to Reeves and told him no. The afternoon the rejection was delivered. Victor Langford did something none of them expected. He came to the Carter Ranch himself. He arrived alone, which was itself a signal. No hired men, no documentation, no performance of authority. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard and called out, and Clara came to the door. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'd like a word." She stepped outside. William appeared in the barn doorway and stayed there because he understood without being told that Clara needed to handle this herself, and his role right now was simply to be visible. Langford looked different than the last time he'd come. Still polished, still composed, but something in it was working harder than before. The ease was performed rather than natural, and Clara could see the seams. "You turned down a fair offer," he said. "It wasn't fair," she said. "It was calculated. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. "What is it you actually want, Mrs. Carter? Because I don't think this is really about the ranchers." "It is entirely about the ranchers," she said. "It's about proving something," he said. "A woman who arrived here with nothing bought at auction for $2. He paused, letting the words do their intended work. "Proving that she matters. I understand the impulse." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Langford," she said quietly, "I know exactly what you're doing right now. You're trying to make this personal so that I make an emotional decision instead of a strategic one." She kept her voice even. "I will tell you clearly it doesn't work. My personal feelings are not the relevant factor here." She paused. "The relevant factors are 4 years of stockyard records, a compound interest clause that a territorial court has already agreed to examine, and 23 ranchers who have submitted sworn statements to the Denver court about how your business practices affected their families." Another pause. "Would you like to talk about any of those things? Because those are the conversations I'm available for." Langford was very still. And in that stillness, Clara saw it, the thing underneath the polished surface, the thing his smooth manner had always been designed to cover. Not confidence. Fear. The specific calculating fear of a man who has built a structure and is watching someone take it apart piece by piece and cannot find the place to stop her. "This will cost you," he said. Quiet. Not a threat exactly. Something more like a fact admitted reluctantly. "It already has," she said. "That's how you know we're serious." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away. This time, watching him go, Clara felt something different than she had the first time he'd ridden away from this house. The first time she had felt the cold clarity of understanding that a real fight was coming. This time, she felt something warmer. Something that knew the shape of the ending before it arrived. William crossed the yard and stood beside her. "He's going to stop fighting," he said. Not a question. "He's going to keep fighting," she said. "But he's going to lose." 90 days became 70. The case was heard in the territorial court in Denver on a Tuesday in late spring. Clara and William made the journey together. Ed Marsh came. Frank Grady came. Dale Langford came and sat in the gallery with his hands folded in his lap and his face composed. And when the judge asked if the records he had provided were accurate and complete, he said yes without hesitation. Reeves presented the case with the methodical efficiency of a man who knows his evidence is airtight and doesn't need theater. Clara sat in the gallery and watched and felt the strange compressed sensation of weeks of work arriving at this single point. Langford's lawyer argued. He was good. Clara acknowledged that privately. He found the thin places in the argument pressed on the word potentially in the original legal assessment questioned Dale's motives. He did everything a good lawyer does. It wasn't enough. The compound interest clause was found to be unenforceable as written under Colorado territorial law. The documented pattern of pricing. Langford's payments versus actual market values was ruled sufficient basis for a civil recovery action on behalf of the affected ranchers. The court ordered a full accounting to be conducted by an independent party with recovery payments to follow. Victor Langford was not sent to jail. Clara had never expected that the law was what it was and what he had done, while deeply wrong had been accomplished through paperwork rather than violence, and paperwork crimes had paperwork consequences. But the financial penalties were real, and the court's public ruling on the unenforceable loan clauses meant that every debt in the valley recalculated overnight. 4 years of compound interest removed. Principal only at the original rates. Frank Grady's debt recalculated under the court ruling dropped by 62%. When Clara told him over the phone at the Red Hollow General Store, Agnes had made the connection because Agnes was now deeply invested in the cooperative's success. He was quiet for a long time. "Say that number again," he said. She said it again. Another silence. "My wife," he said. And then his voice failed completely, and the line was quiet except for his breathing. "Mr. Grady," Clara said. He managed, "Yeah." "Go home and tell her," she said. "Go home right now." "Yeah," he said again. "I will." The cooperative took 18 months to become what Clara had seen in her mind on the first night she'd sat at a rough kitchen table with a failing rancher's ledger. 18 months of meetings and arguments and setbacks, and the particular grinding work of building something that has to hold the weight of real people's real lives. There were months when the freight costs from Pueblo ran high and the math got tight. A bad summer that hit 2 of the member ranches hard enough that the cooperative had to carry them for a season. A dispute between the Muller brothers and Tom Briggs over water rights that had nothing to do with the cooperative but nearly poisoned the working relationships inside it, until Clara sat all 3 men down and talked them through it with the patient firmness of someone who knows exactly how much is at stake. It was not a fairy tale. It was work. Every single day it was work. But it held. William rebuilt the north fence properly and hired 2 hands in the second year, which was the first time in the ranch's history, under his ownership, that he'd had the financial security to do so. He expanded the herd. He repaired the barn roof, which had been a problem since before he inherited the place. He rode fences in the morning and came home in the evenings and sat across from Clara at the kitchen table. And they talked about the cooperative, about the ranchers, about the cases. Ed Marsh brought to them with increasing regularity, as word spread, that the Carter Ranch was a place where problems got solved. And underneath all of that, running through all of it, quiet and steady as a creek that doesn't dry out the thing between them that had been building since $2 silver hit an auctioneer's table, and a broke cowboy looked into a humiliated woman's eyes and apologized. It was Clara who named it. Not dramatically, not with prepared words. On an ordinary evening sitting at the ordinary table, when William said something quiet and funny about Ed Marsh's new horse, and she laughed a real laugh, unguarded the kind she hadn't had access to for years, and looked at him and found him watching her with that expression, the one that had always meant something he wasn't saying. "William," she said. "Yeah. I want you to know something." "Tell me." "I came here with nothing," she said. "I came here having been told very publicly that I had nothing to offer." She held his gaze. "And what I've found here, the work, the cooperative, what we've built." She stopped. Then more quietly, "And you. What I've found in you." She paused. "I did not expect any of it. I had stopped expecting." A beat. "I'm very glad I was wrong to stop." William looked at her for a long moment. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "Carter," she said. Something moved through his face. Warm, undisguised, the expression of a man who has stopped managing what he lets other people see. "Clara Carter," he said. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second day when you told Ed Marsh to his face that his stubbornness was less important than $6 a head." She stared at him. "The second day," she said. "Maybe the first," he said. "The ledger. When you said it wasn't hopeless." She was quiet for a moment. "You might have said something," she said. "You were busy," he said. "There was always something urgent." She looked at him. "There is always going to be something urgent," she said. "That is not going to change." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm saying it now." He moved around the table, and she stood. And when he took her face in his hands, those rough, honest, hard-working hands, and looked at her with everything he'd been holding back finally present and visible, Clara felt something she had no polished words for. She felt completely and simply like herself. The fullest version of herself. The version that had been waiting underneath all the competence and the strategy and the careful management of her own feelings for someone to see her not as a problem to be managed or a resource to be used, but as a person who was worth the full, unhurried attention of another person who had chosen her freely. He kissed her, and she kissed him back. Years passed. The cooperative grew to include 31 member ranches and extended its supply purchasing agreement into lumber and equipment as well as feed. The legal victory in Denver was cited in 2 subsequent territorial cases involving predatory loan practices, and Reeves wrote to Clara both times to let her know because he understood that she would want to. Victor Langford sold his Red Hollow holdings in the 2nd year after the court ruling and relocated to New Mexico, where, from what Dale reported, he was considerably more circumspect about his business methods. Dale himself, after leaving the Pueblo stockyards, eventually joined the cooperative's administrative office at Clara's invitation after a long conversation in which she made clear that what he had done by coming to that table with those records was the most consequential act of honesty she had witnessed in her years in Colorado, and that it deserved to mean something ongoing. He stayed. The sheriff who had ridden to intercept the cattle drive retired 2 years later. His replacement was a man recommended by Marshall Howell, which was to say, a man recommended by someone who understood what law was supposed to be for. Ed Marsh's son did go to school. He studied law. He came back to Red Hollow 12 years later and set up a practice, and one of his first clients was Tom Briggs's daughter. And that is a different story. But it started here in this valley in the years when a cooperative and a court case and 23 ranchers' sworn statements rebuilt something that had been quietly broken for a long time. And the Carter Ranch. The north fence was replaced twice and held. The herd grew to 200 head. The house, the rough, cold, functional house where a woman with a carpet bag had sorted financial documents. The first night of her marriage was added onto twice warmly and carefully, with rooms that got sun in the morning and a porch that caught the evening light. Clara kept the ledger. The original one from the first night. She kept it in the same chest where she kept Dale's records and Reeves's letters and the court ruling. And one other thing, a small paper folded twice, which was a receipt from the Red Hollow marriage auction in the amount of $2 made out in the name of William Carter, dated 1881. She had found it in the bottom of William's coat pocket 3 months after the auction. She had never told him she had it. She had simply kept it because it was the beginning of everything, and some things deserved to be kept. One evening late years into the life they had built, William found her at the table with the ledger open. He did it sometimes still when something needed working through because old habits of mind run deep, and Clara's mind had always worked most clearly when there was a ledger in front of it. He sat across from her. "What are you working on?" he said. "The Henderson expansion numbers," she said. "He wants to add 15 head, and I'm running the pasture capacity against the water rights." He nodded. He poured coffee. He sat in comfortable, familiar silence while she worked. After a few minutes, she set the pen down. She looked at him across the table. This man she had been bought by and been saved by and had saved in return. This man who had stood in front of a crowd of people laughing at her and set $2 silver on a table and said, "I'll take her." This man who had told her the ranch was hers before it had occurred to her to want it. This man who loved her plainly and consistently, and without any of the conditions that had made other people's regard feel like something to be earned and could be lost. "William," she said. He looked up. "The Henderson numbers are fine," she said. "He should do it." "Then why are you still up?" She considered. "I was thinking about the first night," she said. "Sitting here. The ledger. You across the table. What about it?" "You asked me if you could ask me something," she said. "About the platform. Why I didn't cry." "I remember. I told you I was thinking about my father." She paused. "That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth." He waited. "I didn't cry," she said, "because some part of me, the part that was still believing my father's voice over everyone else's, was thinking, this is not finished. Whatever this is, it is not finished. Something is still coming." She looked at him. "I didn't know what. I didn't know you. I didn't know any of it." She paused. "But I knew the story wasn't done." William looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Was it worth it?" he said. "The whole of it. Everything that came after." She looked at him steadily. "At this table, this house, this man, This life that had been built from the rubble of two broken situations by two people who had without planning to become each other's best answer. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without qualification. Every single day of it. He reached across the table. She took his hand. Outside Red Hollow settled into its evening, and the valley that had once been run by one powerful man's fear and greed was quietly, ordinarily, stubbornly itself. 31 ranches working together. Families sleeping without the cold arithmetic of Langford's compound interest waking them at 3 in the morning, a cooperative that had started as a desperate idea on a piece of paper at midnight and had become the kind of thing that simply was, that people took for granted the way they took for granted, clean water and solid fence lines. That was the real $2, not a transaction, not a rescue, not even a marriage. A beginning chosen freely by both of them in the only currency that had ever actually mattered. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman who rebuilt a valley. And the cowboy who spent his last $2 on a stranger had gained something no amount of money could have bought him. He had gained a partner who saw him fully, chose him daily, and loved him in the specific, unspectacular, absolutely extraordinary way that real love works, not as a feeling that arrived once and stayed, but as a decision made again and again in ledgers and courtrooms and late-night kitchens and ordinary evenings at a table where two people who had once been told they had nothing to offer had built between them everything.